I received an anonymous message that this was going to happen, and I poo-pooed it. I didn't believe it. But here we have a story from Bloomberg. White House drafts order to look into Google and Facebook practices. I wonder about Twitter. But this is really interesting. There's been a lot of speculation from people for the past month. You've heard it in the scuttlebutt and the rumors that Trump was going to make some executive order to look into bias. And boy, did I have a debate last night about why social media should be regulated versus why it shouldn't. And it is no secret, I lean in favor of regulation. All right, we'll read this story a little bit. Destiny, the streamer, I know very little about him. I think there's a lot we disagree on. I think there's probably a lot we agree on. But people say he's like an SJW and all that stuff. But he said, you have all these conservatives saying like, oh, it's my private business and stuff. And then finally, when they're facing the brunt of the strength of a private business, all of a sudden they want regulation. And so he's like, fuck them. And I'm like, dude, I've always been a social liberal and in favor of regulation. So when I say now that I think we do need regulation on social media, I have reasons for why I believe that should be the case. Granted, my position isn't diehard. I'm not willing to, fall on my sword to defend the idea that social media companies should be regulated. I just lean towards they should, and there's a few reasons why. And I'm willing to hear people explain why they think it should. I heard really, really great arguments the other night. This guy was telling me, he said, if you tell Twitter and Facebook they have to protect certain speech, you're basically saying the government has the right to tell someone that they have to host someone else, and they shouldn't have to do that. And, my argument is basically, look, either I don't think we could ever break up Twitter. We're not gonna end Twitter. We're not gonna turn Twitter into 5 services. Twitter is a specific thing that serves a specific purpose, like a communications, like a network, like AT&T. Twitter serves a purpose that is similar but different from Facebook, that is similar but different from Google. And so, in terms of social media, we don't have monopolies, right? But in terms of the specific functions of those social media platforms, they're total monopolies. We can't break up Facebook. The point of Facebook is a network. So you can't break it up into mini networks because then people would want to interact across network. What do you do, sign up for 5 companies? It doesn't make sense. So then we have the problem of, we know social media is used to manipulate people, to manipulate elections. So do we just let massive multinational billion-dollar corporations with Saudi investors just do whatever they want? My opinion, no. Let's read the story. I don't want to waste your time. White House drafts order to look into Google Facebook practices. Executive order is preliminary and isn't clear will be signed. All right, so maybe nothing happens, maybe. President has complained companies totally discriminating. I gotta admit, I'm really good at impersonations, but Trump is hard for me to nail down. I could do Obama pretty good. The White House has I could do Alex Jones really good. The White House has drafted an executive order for President Donald Trump's signature that would instruct federal antitrust and law enforcement agencies to open investigations into the business practices of of Alphabet Inc.'s Google, Facebook, and other social media platforms. Not Apple. That was a slip of the tongue. The order is in its preliminary stages and hasn't yet been run past other government agencies, according to a White House official. Bloomberg News obtained a draft of the order. The document instructs U.S. antitrust authorities to thoroughly investigate whether any online platform has acted in violation of antitrust laws. It instructs other government agencies to recommend within a month after it's signed actions that could potentially protect competition among online platforms and address online platform bias. The document doesn't name any specific companies. If signed, the order would represent a significant escalation of Trump's antipathy towards Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media companies, whom he has publicly accused of silencing conservative voices and news sources online. Social media is totally discriminating against Republican conservative voices, Trump said on Twitter in August. Speaking loudly and clearly for the Trump administration, we won't let that happen. They are closing down the opinions of many people on the right, while at the same time doing nothing to others. First, let me say, there are many people on the left who have been censored. Absolutely. There are many people on the right who have been censored. However, there are specific examples that say to me that there is a targeting of the right and a very clear understanding of why that's the case. The Proud Boys were called an extremist group. They were purged from Twitter. Hamas is still on Twitter. You're not going to argue to me that Hamas is less extreme than the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are like frat bros who go to rallies and get into fights with Antifa. Antifa shows up, fights break out. Specific branded Antifa cells that operate in these cities like Berkeley and Portland, they have names, they have logos, have not been banned. Okay, so if you're going to complain there's extremist groups fighting in the street and ban one of them, sorry, Antifa was actually listed as terrorists by the DHS, and, how is that not bias, right? Social media companies have acknowledged in congressional hearings that their efforts to enforce prohibitions against online harassment have sometimes led to erroneous punishment of political figures on both left and right, and that once discovered, those mistakes have been corrected. They say there is no systematic effort to silence conservative voices. No, just an accidental one. It really annoys me when I see people like BuzzFeed. I did a video about this where they're like, conservatives think there's this big liberal conspiracy. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I'll do this. Maybe conservatives think that. I wouldn't know. I'm not conservative. The ones I talk to don't think that, but sure, as a liberal, I believe that there is a natural bias among people who work at Twitter inadvertently that results in people being banned through policy decisions that affect one side more than the other, and through personal bias of choosing to ban one thing over the other. For one thing, they probably use an algorithm and a technology solution for banning a lot of people, but think about this. If a conservative like Ben Shapiro believes that, being trans is a mental illness and there are only two genders, you can't say that on Twitter because it's hate speech. That is a typical conservative position. By all means, you're allowed to believe it's hate speech if you're on the left, but if Twitter is going to say we're going to ban these ideas, and those are like common thoughts and principles and ideas among conservatives, you have just said a specific idea that you don't agree with, that they do, is not allowed on your platform. Legally, they're allowed to do it, but don't tell me you're not biased if your system is set up in such a way that conservatives can't even express a position they have. Sure, you can call it traditionalist. If Ben Shapiro says he's going to mispronoun, he's not going to use the preferred pronouns of trans people, that's potentially hate speech, right? If you're specifically doing it to somebody, they could argue it's hate speech. It's meant to deride the individual. Twitter will ban you for these things. Twitter has banned conservatives for some very minor things, but their policies specifically align to a left-wing view. It's not necessarily a systematic. It's an inadvertent system. Okay, in my opinion. I really do believe there are people at Twitter, Facebook, Google, and many other companies who are, on purpose banning conservatives. But for the most part, I think you have a system set up that just favors the left. And that's one of the biggest problems. The draft order directs that any actions federal agencies take should be consistent with other laws, an apparent nod to concerns that it could threaten the traditional independence of U.S. law enforcement or conflict with the First Amendment, which protects political views from government regulation. Because of their critical role in American society, it is essential that American citizens are protected from anti-competitive acts by dominant online platforms, the order says. It adds that consumer harm, a key measure in antitrust investigations, could come through the exercise of bias. Somebody said to me yesterday, should we just shut down Twitter, right? What if the government said we're going to regulate Twitter to protect elections and free speech? What if Twitter just said, we're shutting down? And I said, okay, problem solved. Okay. Listen, there was a hacker who hacked into the Associated Press, posted a fake tweet about a terror attack, and the U.S. stock market dropped by like $4 billion. We should not have a flaw in our system that large. So I think something should be done. Apparently, Trump agrees, at least a little bit. He hasn't signed it yet. But somebody agrees, okay? And if your argument is, how about we just get rid of Twitter altogether? And I'm like, well, that still would prevent some of the problems. Personally, hiccups. Personally, I don't think getting rid of technology because we have faults with it is the appropriate thing to do, but sure, deleting Twitter is certainly a solution to the problem of election meddling, of bias, of public influence problems, and like lack of free speech and all that stuff. Sure, right? So, ultimately, I guess I won't get into like the full argument as to why I think we probably should have regulation. But what was interesting is I did a poll on Twitter a while ago. I think I did. Maybe it was somebody else's. But I remember a poll on Twitter that asked about regulation, and something like more than half of conservatives said no regulation, but it, like 40 some odd percent said yes regulation. And I want to end with one thing. Look, you might be against regulation, okay? But sometimes you have to accept defeat. You have to retreat to win. If conservatives are not allowed to exist on these platforms and express their ideas, they will cease to exist. Given long enough period of time, there are enough conservatives who will self-censor to exist on the platform, which will make the public perception lean in a certain direction. You will evaporate. End of story. So what needs to happen right now, even though I disagree with a lot of these positions, I don't think this kind of, biased corruption is I don't mean corruption in the sense that like evil people. I mean corruption as in like the system is degrading. I don't agree with it. And I would much prefer to actually have real conversations with conservatives to actually convince people honestly and openly about certain ideas I have and really exchange. Because I don't think we improve our society by homogenizing it. I believe there's a lot of ideas conservative have that I've never heard that would probably convince me of a lot of things, and I need to hear them. This scares me as a liberal who believes in a lot of things that are at odds with conservatives. So I'll say this. I've been in favor of regulation for a long time. To an extent, right? I think when I was younger, I was really opposed to it as like a young anarchist, and as I got older, I was kind of okay with it, and now I'm a little bit more okay with it. But I like the mixed economy we have, right? Our system, it leans in favor of capitalism, but it does have a bit of socialist tendencies. It's a mixed economy, and I can appreciate that, right? I think the extreme ends could be bad. But at this point, I would say to conservatives, there are a lot of ideas that are at risk, not just conservative ones. And we need people to say, you know what, maybe we should protect this service like a utility. The argument I heard that I liked was that Verizon and AT&T aren't going to kick you off of their phone service because of something you said to your friend over the phone. Twitter shouldn't do that either. If you want to say something, you should be allowed to say it. Honestly, I think, in my opinion, this might be a little extreme, but I actually lean towards Twitter shouldn't police any hate speech at all. It should be, everything should be, is it legal or not? Okay, and then if you want to say something, I guess the problem then is, for Twitter, if they don't do something about hate speech, there's a lot of people who don't want to be on the platform. And I'm like, yeah, but you know what? Think about the real world, right? If there's a dude standing in the middle of a field yelling a bunch of weird, Nazi bullshit, a lot of people aren't going to want to stand in that field either, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's a public field, it's public speech. And I think the idea that something different should apply to Twitter, Facebook, and whatever is wrong. So it's not so much that I want the government to force someone to do something, but to force them not to do things, right? Yeah. Anyway, I think that might be the last video for today because I'm running super late and there's a bunch of stuff going on, but thanks for hanging out. I will have another video on my main channel tomorrow at 4 p.m. And I might actually have a bunch of bonus videos today. Okay, so anyway, thanks for hanging out. I'll see you tomorrow.